On a cold night in the autumn of 1944, in a darkened control room somewhere in the western half of the German Reich, a young Luftwaffe radar operator sat in front of a circular glass screen and watched the war the way almost no one else in the world could see it. He was looking at light, faint green echoes drifting across the face of a Würzburg radar, each one a four-engine British bomber loaded with high explosive and incendiaries, grinding eastward through the dark toward a German city. For most of 3 years, men like him had been the most important pair of eyes in the night sky over Europe. They could see what the bomber crews could not see. They could see what the fighter pilots could not see. They could see in the dark. And on this night, that was about to stop being enough. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. To understand why that night mattered, and why men like him would come to dread shapes in their screens they could not explain, you have to go back to the beginning of the Night War and understand how good the German defense had once been. When the British began bombing Germany in earnest, they came at night because at night the bomber was nearly safe. Darkness was a wall. A fighter pilot could not shoot what he could not find, and over a blacked-out continent, with no moon, a single bomber was a black shape in a sky the size of an ocean. The Germans solved that problem the way the 20th century solved most of its problems. With a machine. They learned to see in the dark with radar. They built two kinds. The first was called Freya, a long-range early warning set that could find a bomber stream more than 70 miles out, far over the North Sea, while the crews were still climbing through the dark. Freya told the Germans the bombers were coming, and roughly where. What could not do was tell them precisely enough to kill. For that there was a second radar, called Würzburg, a dish that turned on its mounting and held a single aircraft in a narrow beam, reading its range, its bearing, and its height with an accuracy the early war had never seen. One radar to find the swarm, another to pick out the single insect inside it. A Luftwaffe general named Joseph Kamhuber took those machines and built them into a system, and the system was for a time one of the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world. He divided the night sky over the approaches to Germany into a chain of boxes, each box a piece of airspace controlled from a single ground station. The crews called the arrangement Himmelbett, a German word for a four-poster bed, after the way the controlled zone was framed. Inside each box sat one Freya to find the bombers, and two Würzburg radars, one of them locked onto an incoming bomber, the other locked onto a single German night fighter that had been sent up to wait. On a plotting table lit from beneath, an operator watched 2 points of light, the bomber and the fighter, and a ground controller spoke into the night fighter's radio and walked it across the dark, closing the gap between the two until the German pilot could see the enemy's exhaust flames ahead of him. Find, track, vector, kill. One controller, one fighter, one bomber at a time, repeated down a line that ran from Denmark across the Low Countries to the borders of France. The fighters themselves carried their own smaller radar. A twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110, or a Junkers Ju-88, and later a purpose-built machine called the Heinkel He-219, would go up with a second crewman in the back, a radio and radar operator the Germans called the Bordfunker, hunched over a small screen running a set called Liechtenstein. Its antenna hung off the nose of the fighter in a bristling array of dipoles that the pilots hated because it stood out in the wind and cost them speed. But it worked. Once the ground controller had brought the fighter to within a couple of miles, the Bordfunker took over, reading his own scope, talking his pilot the last distance through the blackness until the bomber loomed up huge in front of them. And then the best of the German night crews did something the bombermen, for a long time, did not understand and could not counter. They slid underneath the bomber, into its blind spot below the belly, where no gun could reach them, and they fired upward into the wings and the fuel tanks with a pair of cannon angled toward the sky. The Germans called it Schräge Musik, slanted music. A bomber would simply come apart in the dark, with no warning, no tracer, no attacker ever seen, and the crews fly alongside it would report only that one of their own had exploded for no reason anyone could name. For the men in the control rooms, it became a kind of grim choreography. A night's work was a series of small dramas played out in points of light and clipped radio calls. A blip would appear at the edge of the Freya's reach. The Würzburgs would swing onto it. A fighter would be scrambled into its box. And then, for a few minutes, a young man at a plotting table would hold two human crews in his hands, the Bombers 7 and the Night Fighters 2, and steer one toward the other across miles of freezing dark, until the radio crackled with the word that meant it was finished. He was not in the air. He never saw the burning. But the picture was his, and the picture decided who lived. At its height, this system made the night sky over Germany the most dangerous airspace in the world. The proof came on the night of the 30th of March, 1944, when the Royal Air Force sent nearly 800 bombers to Nuremberg. The German controllers read the raid early, fed their fighters into the stream, and the killing went on for most of the route. 95 British bombers did not come home. It was the worst single-night bomber command suffered in the entire war. More than 500 men were dead in a few hours in the dark. And in the control rooms, the radar operators have been the quiet center of all of it, the men who turned darkness into a picture and handed that picture to the guns. In the spring of 1944, if you had asked one of them whether the night belonged to Germany, he would not have understood the question. Of course it did. He could see in the dark. The enemy could not. But an advantage built entirely on seeing has a particular weakness. It can be taken away the instant the enemy learns to blind you. And the British had already learned. On the night of the 24th of July, 1943, during a series of raids on Hamburg, the bombers began throwing something new out into the slipstream. Bundles of paper strips backed with thin aluminum, each one cut to a length tuned to the wavelength of the German radar. The crews shoved them out by the thousands, then the millions, and as they fluttered down through the beams, each strip threw back its own echo. On the Würzburg screens, a single clean blip became a smear, then a snowstorm, then a wall of false returns through which no bomber could be picked out at all. On the Liechtenstein sets and the Night Fighters, the same thing happened, the screen filling edge to edge with garbage. The British called the strips window. In one night, the most advanced air defense system in the world went very nearly blind. The Himmelbett boxes, the whole careful machine of one controller and one fighter and one bomber, stopped working because the controller could no longer tell his own hand from the enemy's. The Germans were not fools, and they did not simply give up. They tore up their own doctrine and improvised. If they could no longer guide a single fighter onto a single bomber, they would pour fighters into the bomber stream as a whole and let the crews hunt freelance, by eye and by the glow of burning cities. They built new radar sets that worked on wavelengths the early window could not jam. They put running commentary out over the radio, a controller describing the course and height of the whole raid, so that every fighter in the air could steer toward it. The night did not become safe for the bomber crews again. Nuremberg, after all, came nearly a year after Hamburg. But something had changed that would never change back. The German operator was no longer the calm master of a clean picture. He was a man fighting to see it all, through interference that grew worse every month, trying to hold onto a war that had begun to slip out of the frame of his screen. And then the night turned against him in a way that was more personal and more frightening than mere jamming. The British worked out that the German night fighters were themselves broadcasting. Every Liechtenstein set in the nose of every Messerschmitt was pouring radar energy out into the dark, and energy can be traced back to its source. So the Royal Air Force began sending its own night fighters, fast wooden mosquitoes, up into the bomber stream and beyond it, fitted with receivers that homed in on the German radar's own emissions. The hunter's radar, the very thing that let him find the bomber, had become a beacon that drew a killer onto his tail. A German crew that switched on its set to search the dark might now be lighting a lamp for a mosquito it would never see. The Bordfunker, the radar operator in the back of the night fighter, learned to be afraid of his own equipment. And the ground crews learned that the airfields themselves were no longer safe, that an intruder might be circling above the runway lights, waiting for a tired night fighter to come home low on fuel with its landing lamps on. The men who had owned the night were now being hunted in it. Through all of this, the bombers that the German operators tracked night after night were British. The Americans, the other half of the great air offensive against Germany, came in daylight, in tight formations of heavy bombers that fought their way to the target in the sun. For most of the war, The German radar operator's nighttime enemy spoke English with a British accent. But the Americans had their own night problem, and they had been working on it. Their first attempts had been poor. An early American night fighter, a conversion of a light attack bomber called the Havoc, simply could not climb high enough or fast enough to catch anything worth catching. American squadrons that needed to fight in the dark had borrowed British aircraft, Beaufighters, and then Mosquitoes because their own country had not yet built them anything better. But something better was coming, and it had been designed from a blank sheet of paper for one purpose only: to kill in the dark. It was called the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, and it did not look like any fighter the war had produced. It was huge. Where the German night fighters were converted bombers and the British flew a sleek wooden Mosquito, the Black Widow was a purpose-built machine with a wingspan of about 66 feet, twin booms running back from twin engines to a high tail, and a stubby central crew pod slung between them. Many of them were painted a glossy black that drank the light. Two Pratt and Whitney radial engines, each an 18-cylinder double WASP turning out a little over 2,000 horsepower, hauled it through the air at a little more than 360 miles per hour. It carried a crew of 3, a pilot, a gunner seated behind and above him, and back in the tail of the crew pod, the man who mattered most on a dark night, a radar operator bent over a scope of his own. For underneath the Black Widow's blunt nose sat an American airborne radar, a set known as the SCR-720, one of the best night fighting radars of the war, able to reach out into the blackness ahead of the aircraft and find another machine miles away. Where the German Bordfunker fought a losing battle with jamming and the fear of being homed upon, the American radar operator carried into the night sky an instrument that was newer and in important ways better than anything the defenders had left. The Black Widow's teeth matched its eyes. 4 20mm cannon were mounted in the belly of the central pod, a concentrated punch heavy enough to tear the wing off a bomber or saw a fighter in half in a single pass. Some of the aircraft also carried a remotely aimed turret on top of the pod with 4 heavy machine guns, although that turret had a habit of setting up a savage, buffeting through the tail at certain angles, and many crews simply locked it to fire straight ahead and flew without it. The gun that mattered was the 4 cannon below, and the eye that aimed it was the radar. The men who would fly it into the European night belonged to a small number of American night fighter squadrons, among them the 422nd and the 425th, units of the 9th Air Force that had trained in England through the first half of 1944 and taken their first Black Widows into combat that summer. As the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and drove east across France and Belgium, the night fighter squadrons followed them, moving from English bases to rough forward fields on the continent, closer and closer to Germany. And so, for the first time, in the last autumn of the war, American radar-equipped night fighters began flying combat patrols in the dark over the western edge of the Reich. They flew defensive patrols over Allied airfields and the front, hunting German intruders and reconnaissance aircraft. They flew offensive sweeps into German airspace, prowling for the enemy's own night fighters and shooting up what they found on the ground. And they joined the hunt for the small, fast, pilotless flying bombs the Germans were launching toward Allied cities and ports. They were arriving into a night sky that was no longer the one the German operators had ruled in 1943. It was a sky where the radar picture came smeared with interference, where the early warning belt was beginning to shrink as ground stations were overrun, where the best German night crews were dead and their replacements half-trained, and where switching on your own radar might call down a killer you would never see. Into that wounded, narrowing darkness came a new shape, a great black twin boom machine with American eyes and 4 cannon in its belly, and the men watching the German screens did not yet have a name for it. They were about to learn one. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. The men of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron had been in England since the spring of 1944, training in the dark over English farmland, learning the Black Widow the way you learn any machine that will either save you or kill you, by flying it past the edge of what you think it can do and finding out where the edge actually is. They had been told that the P-61 was the most advanced night fighting aircraft in the world. They had also been told that the thing holding its gun turret would shake the tail to pieces in certain flight regimes, and they had spent a portion of their training discovering which of these facts mattered more on a given night. The answer was that both mattered in different ways, and that the art of flying the Black Widow was largely the art of knowing which problem to solve first. By the summer of 1944, they were flying combat missions. The Normandy landings had gone in on the 6th of June, and through those long summer weeks the night fighter squadrons flew defensive patrols over the beachhead and the supply corridors that fed the armies ashore. German aircraft came at night to find the ships and the bridges and the fuel dumps, the way German aircraft had come at night over England 3 years before, and the 422nd was there to meet them. Not every patrol produced a contact. Most nights were 8 hours of watching a radar scope and hearing nothing but engine noise and the hiss of the headset. But some nights were different. The radar operator in the back of the Black Widow was called the Radio Countermeasures Officer, a title that covered a great deal of work that had nothing to do with its official name. What it meant, practically, was that this man was responsible for the SCR-720, the American airborne radar set whose antenna sat in the nose behind a plastic radome, invisible from outside, pouring its energy forward into the dark. The set worked on a microwave frequency cinemetric wavelength, which gave it two advantages over most of the German equipment. It produced a clean picture at longer range, and it was significantly harder to jam. Window, the paper and foil strips that had blinded the German Würzburg so thoroughly in 1943, was cut to the wavelength of German sets. It did not work on the SCR-720's frequency. An American radar operator searching the night ahead of him was looking through a cleaner picture than his German counterpart had seen in more than a year. When he found something, the picture of it was precise, ranged to the nearest 100 yards, bearing measured in degrees. A blip that moved, that turned, that climbed or dove, that was clearly not a ground return or a rain cloud, but a machine with an engine and a man at the controls. He would call it to the pilot, begin the vector, close the range. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1.5 miles. The pilot straining forward through the plexiglass, seeing nothing, trusting the voice from the back completely, the way a man trusts a surgeon whose work he cannot watch. And then, sometimes at 1,000 yards or less, a smear of blue exhaust flame would resolve out of the dark ahead of them, and the pilot's hand would make the small adjustments that lined up the cannon, and 420mm rounds per second would begin the work they were made for. The first confirmed aerial victories for the 422nd came in the autumn of 1944, as the squadron moved from English bases to the continent, following the Allied armies across France and Belgium to forward strips still smelling of the German forces that had abandoned them. The work shifted. Defensive patrols over the front lines remained part of the mission, hunting the German intruders that came at night to find the fuel and ammunition concentrations that kept the armies moving. But increasingly the squadron flew offensive, turning the pattern around, taking their radar into German airspace and looking for whatever was there to be found. German night fighters returning to their bases. German bombers. German reconnaissance aircraft feeling their way at altitude over the Allied positions. Transport aircraft supplying pockets of German resistance that the ground advance had cut off from the main lines. The Black Widow was going looking for a war rather than waiting for one to come to it. Among the pilots who flew those missions was a first lieutenant named Hermann Ernst. He was methodical in the way that men who survive night combat tend to be methodical, which is to say he did not take unnecessary risks. He pressed the ones that needed pressing, and he understood in his bones that the radar in the back of his aircraft was worth more than any amount of courage without it. His first confirmed kill came in the closing months of 1944, a Junkers Ju-88 working the night airspace over the front. It came apart in the dark the way things come apart when 420mm cannon hit them from 200 yards, without drama, without warning, with only the sudden bloom of fire that lit the belly of the cloud above it for a few seconds, and then was gone. Ernst turned away, checked his fuel, checked his ammunition, called back to his radar operator, and kept working. By the end of the war, he would be the leading American night fighter ace in the European theater. He did not become this by being romantic about it. Now here is what was happening on the German side of those same nights. and it is more complicated than the title of this story suggests. Because the radar operators who watched the screens in the Western Reich were not simply terrified by the appearance of a new American machine. What they were living through was something more total than that, a slow, systematic destruction of everything that had made their picture clear. The German night defense by the autumn of 1944 was a system that had been hit from multiple directions at once over the course of more than a year, and every hit had taken something away that could not easily be replaced. The Himmelbett system, the careful box-by-box organization that Kammhuber had built, was already gone in the sense that the British had destroyed it with window, and the Germans had moved to a different method. That method, which the Luftwaffe called Zusammensau, Tame Boer, sent night fighters up as a mass rather than a single directed pair and had a running commentator broadcasting the raid's course and altitude over a radio channel all the airborne crews could receive. It worked after a fashion. Nuremberg had been a Zusammensau night, but it required that the ground picture be clear enough for the commentator to build his narrative, and the ground picture was getting worse. The SN2, the second generation of the Liechtenstein radar, had been introduced in part to counter window. It worked on a longer wavelength, one that the original window size could not blank out, and for a period in the second half of 1943 and the early months of 1944, the German night crews had a working airborne radar again, one they could use without the fear that the jamming would wipe their screen. But the Allies had a habit, repeated throughout the war, of capturing the enemy's secrets and turning them. In the summer of 1944, a German night fighter, disoriented and low on fuel, landed by mistake at an airfield in England. It was substantially intact, and its SN2 set was substantially intact, and within weeks the Allies knew the exact operating frequency of the radar they had been unable to jam. New window, cut to the right size, was produced and loaded onto the bombers. By the autumn of 1944, the SN2 picture was degraded too. So the German radar operator, sitting in his control room in the months when the 422nd was flying offensive missions over the Reich, was a man looking at a succession of problems that had no good solutions. His Würzburg could be jammed. His directed control over individual fighters had been largely abandoned because the window had made it impossible to hold two distinct blips on screen for the time the interception required. His night fighter crew's own radar was compromised. His early warning belt was contracting as airfields and control stations in France and Belgium fell to the Allied armies. And now, among the contacts drifting across his screen, some of them were not bombers. Some of them were hunters. The German Air Defense Intelligence had known for some time that the British were flying radar-equipped night fighters over Germany, Mosquitoes in particular. The Mosquito was a known quantity with a known fear attached to it. But the American machine, the twin-boom Black Widow, was newer and in some respects less understood. When reports began coming in of a large twin-engine, twin-boom aircraft with airborne radar engaging German aircraft in the western approaches, there was genuine uncertainty at the staff level about what exactly they were dealing with. It was not small. Its radar was different from the Mosquito's equipment. It carried what appeared to be extremely heavy forward armament. And it was hunting the same airspace that the German night fighter crews had to transit when they scrambled toward the bomber streams. For the crews of the German night fighters, this created a specific problem that had no good solution. The Zusammensau method required that the crews stay in radio contact with the running commentary. It required that they be airborne for extended periods over their own territory, climbing to altitude, maneuvering to intercept a bomber stream. All of that time, there were potential targets for whatever the Allies had sent up that night to hunt them. The German Bordfunker, the radar operator in the back of the night fighter, faced a choice that had no clean answer. Switch on the Liechtenstein to search for bombers and risk drawing a homing missile onto the aircraft. Keep it off and fly blind through a sky that might contain an American radar operator currently watching a blip resolve into the silhouette of their own aircraft from 3 miles out. The best German night crews understood this problem abstractly long before it happened to them personally. A Hauptmann in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, who had spent 3 years learning to kill in the dark, did not need to be told that being hunted was different from hunting. He had simply never expected to be hunted by Americans. The strategic picture that Germany's command had drawn said the American contribution to the night was bombers, large formations of heavy aircraft that blundered through the dark in ways that their own radar operators could track and predict. The idea that American fighters, equipped with radar as good as anything German engineers had produced, were now following his own radar home was a revision to the picture that came without warning and landed hard. Not every German night fighter crew who encountered a Black Widow in the Western Reich had time to report what they had found. Some of them reported nothing at all. The aircraft that did not return, that disappeared from the tracking picture and sent no last transmission, might have been brought down by any of a dozen causes: bomber gunners, flak, mechanical failure, weather, fuel exhaustion. The night erased the evidence reliably. But the pattern over the autumn and winter of 1944 was a pattern the Germans could read, and what it said was that the night was becoming unsafe in ways it had not been unsafe before. Hermann Ernst flew his seventh and final confirmed aerial kill before the war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945. He had operated through a period in which the German night defense was being dismantled not by a single weapon, but by a convergence of pressures, and his aircraft and his radar operator had been one element of that convergence. The score he compiled made him the leading American night ace in the theater, but did not make him the man who ended German radar-controlled night fighting over the Reich. That story was larger than any one aircraft. What happened to the German system in the last year of the war was not a series of dramatic defeats in the sky. It was a quieter kind of dying, a loss of capability that accumulated in layers. Fuel shortages that reduced the number of night fighter sorties. The destruction of radar stations by Allied air attack. The overrunning of forward control posts by the Allied armies. The loss of experienced crews, men who had spent years learning the craft of hunting in the dark and whose experience could not be compressed into a training syllabus for their replacements. The jamming that worsened month by month. The new aircraft that the Allied factories were producing and the German factories were not. And through the late autumn and winter, the appearance of American radar sets in the night sky over the Western Reich, sets that did not blind easily, carried by aircraft that could absorb punishment and give it back in volume. The German operators who sat at their screens through those last months watched a picture that was becoming, slowly and irreversibly, less useful to the men they were trying to protect. They could sometimes see that something was there. They could less often tell their fighters precisely enough to matter. And in the far reaches of the screen, in the margins of their coverage, things moved that did not behave like bombers and did not respond to the patterns the defense had been built to recognize. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe night fighter force that had very nearly broken the RAF's bomber offensive in the winter of 1943 was a fraction of itself in experience and reach and coherence, though individual crews still flew and some still killed. The last German night fighter operations of the war were flown under conditions that would have been unrecognizable to the men who had designed the Himmelbett system in the early years. Fuel for single missions was sometimes hand-measured. Radar sets that needed calibration went uncalibrated because the technicians had been pulled to other tasks. Runways without lights, because lighting a runway was an invitation to whatever was circling above in the dark. The system that had once been the most sophisticated air defense network in the world ended the war as a collection of exhausted men doing what they could with what was left. The Black Widow squadrons that participated in this final phase of the night war over Europe did not always know what they had contributed to the larger picture. They saw the results one contact at a time, one blip on the scope that resolved into a silhouette, one burst of cannon fire, one aircraft that fell away into the dark below. The larger arithmetic was something the historians would work out later, in records and after-action reports, and the testimony of survivors from both sides. What the crews of the 422nd and the 425th knew, as the war in Europe ended in the first days of May 1945, was that they had flown through German airspace at night, with their radar running, for 8 months, and most of them had come home. The German radar operators who survived the war would in time find ways to describe what those last months had felt like. What they consistently said was not that they had been terrified by any single weapon. What they said was that the picture had gotten smaller, That the night, which they had once been able to read from one edge to the other, had filled with noise they could not clear. That they had watched their tools fail one by one, and that by the end they were working from instinct and fragments where they had once worked from a clean and reliable geometry. The American night fighters, with their cinemetric radar that did not blind easily and their 4 cannon that fired from darkness the German crews could not penetrate, were one piece of that experience. They were not the whole of it. The war, as both of the surviving communities understood in the decade after it ended, had not been settled in the air by any single aircraft or any single night. It had been settled by an equation of production and training and attrition that tilted at Guadalcanal for the Japanese, at the Ruhr for the Germans, and in the waters of the Atlantic where the submarines eventually lost the calculation they had once nearly won. The Black Widow was the final instrument in a sequence that had begun years earlier, when the first window foil had fluttered out of a British bomber and made the Würzburg picture snow. But the aircraft matters for something specific. It matters because it proved that the Americans who had come to the night fight late and come to it equipped with borrowed tools had learned the lesson of the dark well enough to build their own instrument from scratch, get it into the air before the war ended, and carry it over the territory of the most technically sophisticated air defense force the war produced. The radar in the nose of the Black Widow was not inferior to the radar in the nose of the Heinkel He-219. It was at minimum its equal, and in its resistance to jamming it was arguably better. The men in the back of those aircraft, bent over their scopes in the dark, were doing precisely what the German Bordfunker had done in the height of German night supremacy, reading a picture of the sky, closing the distance, talking a pilot into position in the blackness. The technique was the same. The direction had reversed. The German radar operator in his darkened room, watching the green smear of the interfered display through the last winter of the war, was not terrified of a particular silhouette. He was watching the end of the idea that radar alone was enough. That the eye, however good, could survive without everything behind it. The factories that made the aircraft it was carried in, the training pipelines that produced the men who read it, the fuel that got those men into the air, the doctrine that taught them how to use what the eyes saw. The Americans had built all of those things, and they had built them faster and in greater volume than Germany could match. And the Black Widow was only the last evidence of a production that had been going on for years before the P-61 ever left the ground. On a quiet night, in what would have been the late spring of 1945, if the man at the Würzburg had still been sitting there, his screen would have shown him nothing he needed to track. The bombers were no longer coming. The war had moved past him. The long choreography of blips and vectors and radio calls in the dark, the whole machinery of the night that his generation had invented and believed in and built careers upon, had ended not in a single defeat, but in the accumulation of 4 years of a contest that the side with the factories and the pipelines and the replacements was always going to win. The Black Widow had been one proof of that, one of many, a proof delivered at night, invisibly, in the one dimension the Germans had once been certain they owned. They had been wrong about the ownership. What they had owned was an early lead. And the thing about early leads, as the air war over the Reich had demonstrated season by season, is that they are paid forward, not back. The men who held them had to keep paying every night, and on the night in autumn 1944, when a large twin-boomed American aircraft appeared on the edge of the German radar picture for the first time, the account had already been overdrawn. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.